This is the first in a series of videos intended to review the material that we've covered through the year. The good part of taking the Bio 1220 as a CCP is that we stretch out the class over the course of the whole school year, slows down the pace a little bit, but on the other end of it, we have not seen some of this material for almost 7 months. So what I intend to do in these videos is to go through all of our PowerPoints at a very brisk pace and touch on the high points, the things that you may see on the final, some of the other points that we talked about during the school year that were more details, we'll go ahead and just gloss over. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so we started off with history because we were looking at the first fourth of the year, the first 9 weeks, we did natural selection and evolution. And to prepare for that, we looked at how we got to the point where we understand the theory of natural selection and how it relates to evolution. We said Aristotle and Plato were the first two guys to get the party started. They were philosophers, but they did look at the natural world and came up with some theories. And we had a long break. We had the Dark Ages. And Nicholas Steno was one of the first people, I can't say scientists because he was an Italian Catholic bishop, to begin to look at things in a different way. He had the law of superposition that said that geologic strata, the ones that were deeper were older, and the ones that were closer to the surface were newer, but he still believed that fossils came from the moon. So we had a long way to go. Carolus Linnaeus, he really is the founder of everything we know in terms of taxonomy. Some of the things that he did, like family and order, we see aren't quite as applicable today because we have genomic information and that groups things a little bit differently. But we still overall use domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Domain came later. And we said that our mnemonic was do kings play chess on fine gold stools to help you remember. In the beginning, we talked about the fact we were going to have the three domains, and we're looking at each of those, or have looked at each of those in turn. So those will have their own video, as well as the four kingdoms will also have their own video, Protista, fungi, planta, and animalia. Again, videos to come later. And these were the phylum of Animalia that we looked at the last thing for the year. All right, then we move on to another series of scientists. We had William Paley, and he said form fits function. In other words, if an animal has a structure, there's a purpose for that structure. It's not just to make the animal look cool. For example, kangaroo rats have big ears that allow them to radiate heat because they live in the desert and it's very hot. Sharks have nictitating membranes over their eyes that roll up and they protect their eyes when they eat. Alexander Humboldt, he's kind of considered to be the first naturalist. He is the first one to travel and take observations and write about them. And so Darwin patterned his life after Humboldt. Then we got to Hutton, and he had the theory of gradualism. I'm going to change my ink color. Crazy about this guy. Give me just a second here. Ink color. Let's go to blue. Gradualism said that geographic changes take place slowly. That, for example, a stream turning into a creek, turning into a river, turning into a canyon happens over a long period of time. But at this point, they still believe the Earth was 10,000 years old. So it didn't quite match up because these slow changes, you didn't have a lot of time for them to happen. And there was the form fits function. Charles Lyell, his theory was uniformitarianism. And he said the laws that were in place at the early stages of the earth are the same laws that are in place now, that the laws of science, once the ones we come to understand and define, don't change. Cuvier was the father of paleontology. He first proposed the possibility of extinction. Up till now, it was not believed that a species could change. And he said, well, I think that these fossils that we're looking at are actually organisms that existed a long time ago that have become extinct. Erasmus Darwin was Darwin's grandfather, and he said that species can change. So by this point in time, by the 1800s, the late 1700s, scientists are beginning to understand that a species can change into a very different form. Now, the first scientist to propose a mechanism for this was Lamarck, and he had the theory of acquired traits. And he said that where the change comes from the fact that you've got a state of being. So, for example, you have a short neck. Your food, something changes, so you get a change. So for whatever reason, you need to reach higher food. So the organism stretches its neck. It does an action, and that action makes the neck longer. He said at that point, then, and he also had heritability. So he said that these traits get passed to the next generation, and they continue the process. We saw that he wasn't quite as wrong as we originally believed, because epigenetics shows that things that occur in our lives can actually change our genome and be passed to offspring. But overall, this wasn't the final product. It did have the occurrence of there being a change and traits being inherited, but he wasn't quite there yet. So then we get to, we need a couple more pieces of information here. Richard Owen, he had homology versus analogous structures, analogy. And we'll look at that on the next page, what that meant. So Thomas Malthus, he was a economist, and he said that if you have resources, so this is my resource graph, and your population increases, that what's going to happen at this point is that you have a resource, and this is your population mismatch. There's going to be intense competition for those resources. And Darwin and Wallace were able to incorporate that into their theory to say, look, this competition drives things. So let's go back to homology versus analogous structures. So what Owen saw was that if you have the arm of a human and the leg of a cat and the flipper of a whale and the wing of a bat, that each one of these have a bone that relates to the humerus, and each one of these have bones that relate to the radius and ulna. And even though they have slightly different shapes, they are present. And this is also, when we talk about evolution, this is our first piece of evidence. That is homologous structures. We say are a good piece of evidence that show that organisms change and diverge, and they have a lot of similarity because of the similarities in their structures. Now, if we compare this to, oh, come on, flip for me. There we go. Analogous structures. We have the wing of a bat, the wing of a bird, and the wing of a butterfly. And they all have the same function where they help the animal fly, but there is no evolutionary connection between them. In fact, we call this convergent evolution. Where the various lineages of evolutionary pathways converge to the same point, where they have the same structure, but they did not have the same origin. All right, then we get to Darwin, and remember, Wallace also came up with these ideas. We talked a lot about where Darwin, how he incorporated all of the previous scientific ideas in his travels, so on and so forth. But we're going to just focus on the theory. So what he said, he came up with, his theory was called, or he referred to it as descent with modification. And he saw that, well, let's just jump ahead to that slide because we're going to skip all of the history here. There's Wallace. All right, so what he said was he observed, one, that variation exists. Now, one of the common misconceptions that students come in with is that they believe that natural selection causes the variation. That is not true. You have to have variation in order for this process to occur. What we see here is we've got blue bugs, we've got green bugs, and we've got brown bugs. And we're going to talk, we have talked and talked and talked and talked about where variation comes from, why it's important. And especially when we get into the life cycles, the second half of the year, it was just, where's the variation coming from? So number 2, overproduction and heritability. Heritability. Hopefully that's an L. Spelled that right. So he saw that the species produce, and this isn't all species, because later we talk about K strategy and R strategy, produce a lot of offspring. And this is to ensure that at least some of the offspring survive, but it also, the parents pass, or the P1 generation passes their traits to the F1 generation, to the offspring. Again, so these were things that he observed. What that took us to then is that, so this is the result. He saw that the ones that had better adaptations, and we define adaptation as a trait that increases survival. So sometimes this occurs because there's a change, like maybe an environment changes, or something in terms of the predation, or what affects the lifespan of organisms can change. So in this case, let's say that this bird moved into the area. This bird that didn't exist in this area before migrates into this area, and it prefers to eat these bugs. But the bugs that are brown are better adapted to their environment, and the bird will tend to eat the green and the blue bugs because it can see it. So the ones that are better adapted, which are these brown bugs, are more likely to survive. And the ones that are less adapted are less likely. And then number 4 is the reproduction. And sometimes we call this reproductive advantage. The better adapted individuals survive to reproduce and pass on their characteristics. And over time, we see a shift in populations. Remember, natural selection. So this is a natural selection overview. Natural selection does not change a species. That's evolution. Evolution is over a long period of time. We went on then to, we talked about the difference between natural selection and evolution. And we said evolution can actually give rise to what we call speciation, the emergence of a new species, with natural selection happening on populations over and over and over and over. There are 5 pieces of evidence that we use as our foundation for saying that that evolution is what it is. The first one was homology versus analogy. Second one is embryology. So this is evidence number 2. And what we see here is even animals as difference between a fish and a human. If you look at their starting embryos, they are very, very similar. And this implies that we at some point had a common ancestor and diverged from one another, but our start point were similar. Our homologous structures are similar. And it's those similarities that we say show us that evolution is, in fact, real. Evidence number 3, fossils. We can look at the fossil record. And again, we can see that we have changes that take place. And again, look at the 48 million to, so we've got a 40 million time frame here where we see small changes in the fossil record that imply that we went from this structure to that structure. Evidence number 4 is the genetic code. All organisms have the same 4 nucleotides: adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine. And we see as the organisms become more complex the genome becomes more complex. And that also implies, again, we started off with something that was more rudimentary. We evolved into something that was more complex. Number 5. Artificial selection. If you don't believe that a species can change, I dare you to look at a wolf next to a chihuahua and know that there were no chihuahuas just a few hundred years ago. A few, whatever. I don't know how long chihuahuas have been around actually, but that we have created that by choosing which traits get to be carried on and choosing for specific whether it be meat in animals or behavior in dogs. We can see great changes in species. So, all right, epigenetics, we talked about that a little bit. Lamarck wasn't completely crazy. Okay, so what drives natural selection? So we know that natural selection drives evolution, but what drives natural selection? And what we said was we have these factors that drive natural selection. We're going to talk about these. So mutation is a random change in the genetic code. And one of the things we said was if you have something new, if you have a brand new trait, this is the only place it can take place. Gene flow, genetic drift, those things can change the frequency in alleles, but they don't create new alleles. So if we get new alleles, it's here at genetic mutation. So let's talk about genetic drift first. Genetic drift is when we have a population and we have a chance event. And in this case, we're saying we've got a population of bugs and someone comes along and they step on the bug population. And we end up with more of the red bugs than we do the black-brown bugs due to this. So genetic drift actually is a loss in variation, but it still causes a change in alleles, right? Because we had more black-brown alleles than we did red. And here after this chance event, we have more red. We talked about 2 ways this can take place. Before that, here is the graphs of allele frequency. This is a large population. This is a small population. So if you have a small population, it is much more affected at a greater level by a chance event than a small population. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. A small population is affected much more than a large population. If you have a large population, it can withstand a loss. And you can see here that the allele frequencies kind of stick around this center point. But here, when you have a small population, these allele frequencies are all over the place. 2 of the ways that we can have these events is the founder effect, where you have a few individuals from a population so here we have a group of ladybugs and we get one ladybug that starts a new population on an island. And because we only had a few alleles to start with, our variation's very low. We talked about this with the Amish here in Ohio. You can also have a bottleneck effect. So here's another example of the founder effect where you're starting with good variation. Your variation is high, but here we have low. Another thing you can have is you have, again, this is that critical event, right? Here, maybe it's an environmental change or habitat loss, and you lose the majority of your population, and you only have a few that survive. We would see this with the rhinoceros. Is it rhinoceroses? We had certain species of rhinoceros where we just lost the species was on the verge of extinction, and they couldn't bring it back. They didn't have enough variation. Or anytime you take a species down low, close to extinction, you get a bottleneck effect where when you rebuild, you're not rebuilding with much variation in the alleles. And so that can have a detrimental effect. All right, so that's all genetic drift. Gene flow is when you introduce new alleles into a population. So this is going to increase our variation. Where here I have the Western deer, they have that light brown coat, maybe they have other alleles that are different, and they move into the Eastern deer. And so we have an increase in alleles. Non-random mating drives natural selection. This would increase variation, but I'm sorry, random mating would. Oop. Get my eraser out here. Random mating would. And when we do Hardy-Weinberg, what we see is that we're going to assume that mating is always random. But that's not the case in reality. What happens in reality is the mating is not random. We talked about the lyrebird down here who has the crazy, he's a mimic, and he makes all the crazy bird calls. And the better his calls, the more likely he is to get a mate. The bowerbird builds these elaborate nests, and only the males that have the best nests get to mate. And so in reality, a very, very small portion of the male population, small portion of males, pass on their genetic traits, which is actually less variation. So random mating, while it's actually better, doesn't always happen. And we had the Axe body spray because in humans, right, the guy with the most Axe gets the girl. Maybe not. All right, finally, we looked at selection patterns. So directional, if you have an extreme trait, so we've got a short tail, a long tail. The long tails look like a snake. So what happens is the long tails, we start off the dashed lines, our starting point. So what happens is the short tails are selected against, and we see a movement in one direction or another. Stabilizing the moderate, it selects for the moderate trait. So in other words, there's something that's not great about the extremes. And so we see our bell curve push to the middle and become narrow. Or we can have disruptive selection where the medium, so for example, there's something good about short, there's something good about long tails. The medium aren't particularly helpful. So we see the extremes are selected for. And you should be able to analyze a graph and look at an original population and a population that has changed over time and explain if it's directional, stabilizing, or disruptive. Okay, the next part we're going to go into is population evolution, and we're going to look at Hardy-Weinberg to start with, but that takes care of natural selection. So thanks for watching this video. We'll see you in the next one.